what this has meant is that the left-right political spectrum is essentially a politics of whether there should be more or less market regulation, whether there should be more or less government involvement in producing and protecting human well-being, more or less trade across borders, more or less resource extraction, more or less investment in clean energy, and more or less labor or worker protection. And these questions are essentially all about the role of government in a capitalist economy. So on the left side of the political spectrum, people generally argue that capitalism must be managed to work properly. They argue that the market does not on its own act efficiently, and it doesn't produce the best outcomes or the outcomes that are best for human beings. Human beings and, of course, the rest of the planet. And on the right, people on the right end of the political spectrum, I would say that people tend to argue that the market is rational and efficient, and the government should not intervene to guide or direct the market. That also means that taxes, which tend to redistribute money from people to the government, those taxes should be low, and the scope of government should be narrow. It should be limited so that the proper functions of democracy, the proper functions of government, are essentially those of producing a military and a police force. The proper functions of government are primarily those of protection and very little else. So those are the positions on the left and on the right, and the point that I'm making is that a lot of those positions revolve around different perspectives with regard to what we should do about a market economy, what we should do about capitalism. So the whole dominant framework of politics, the left-right political spectrum, is organized around different conceptions of what a market economy is and the way that a government should engage with and cooperate with a market economy and limit and control a market economy on the other side. So one of the other things that is notable about this left-right spectrum is that neither side, neither the left nor the right, has a serious alternative to our capitalist economy. Whether they believe in more or less market regulation, both sides take the market itself for granted. So both sides are embedded in a neoliberal economic paradigm. And so the debate is really, do we regulate the market more or do we regulate the market less? There's no real, there's no dominant political position that is, let's get rid of the market altogether and have a different system for producing goods and services and assigning and distributing income. So the point there is that neoliberalism, neoliberal market capitalism is hegemonic in the sphere of economics. But not only, I'm arguing in this lecture, not only is it hegemonic in the sphere of economics, liberal and neoliberal frameworks and assumptions also permeate other spheres that we often think of as separate from economics, beyond the sphere of the market. And that includes the sphere of the family, of reproduction, education, healthcare, and so on. So the market and neoliberal, liberal and neoliberal hegemony have extended beyond the sphere of the market to also underpin the way we understand what should be happening in spheres that appear to be beyond the market, like the family, reproduction, education, healthcare, and so on. And many people have argued that at the core of liberalism and neoliberalism is a presumption of human beings as individual rational actors exercising individual responsibility. So this lecture about individual responsibility is intimately connected to the lecture on liberalism, which immediately precedes it. So the belief that individuals are largely responsible for their own fate and outcomes in life, that's basically the definition of individual responsibility, right? The belief that individuals are largely responsible for their own fate and outcomes in life. That set of beliefs is fundamental to liberalism, and then also by extension to neoliberal economics, which is rooted in liberal political and philosophical principles. So the slide that you have here in front of you is basically a series of quotes that make the link between individualism and liberalism or neoliberalism, both in these quotes, both liberalism and neoliberalism. So, for example, at the top there, you've got individualism is the beating heart of liberal ideology. It is very much an article of faith among liberals that the individual is a rational human being responsible for their own behavior. And so ultimately what liberalism is trying to do is to empower the individual with as much freedom as is practically possible. So I'd like you to take a moment to read these quotes. I'm not sure that I really need to read them out for you, but just take a look at that. You can pause the recording right here if you like. So the idea here that I'm trying to drive home is that liberalism is about protecting individual rights and freedoms and about prioritizing the importance of the individual. So the politics of individual responsibility is, by definition, a politics that is embedded in prior ideologies of liberalism and neoliberalism. So politics of individual responsibility is something that has come about over the course of the last 40 years as liberalism and neoliberalism have also become hegemonic. So I'm making the case here that the politics of individual responsibility is so prevalent in our ways of thinking, in our political discourse, and even in our education, that we hardly notice it. We take it for granted. And this political framework of individual responsibility is hegemonic in today's Western societies, and it infiltrates almost all of our conscious and subconscious thinking about justice and fairness, as well as what the solutions are to some of our most intractable problems. So we frame our problems as problems of individual responsibility, and we frame the solutions to those problems as also individual responsibilities. And as you can see, a lot of people have written about the implications of this ideology of individualism and the impact that it has on our values and on our way of organizing social and political life. who is a well-known political theorist and professor at Harvard University. Sandel published a book which was called The Tyranny of Merit. And in this book, he makes an argument that is connected to the point that I'm making about individual responsibility. So what I've assigned for you for today is a podcast in which he discusses this book, his book, for you to listen to. And so I'm going to start by talking about the idea of a meritocracy. I'm going to start by sort of using Sandel as a jumping off point, and then so I'll start by talking about meritocracy, and then connect that to the idea of a politics of individual responsibility. So first of all, it's very important, I think, to contextualize the idea of a meritocracy. And this is the idea that a person's success and their achievements in life depend on or derive from individual merit. So if a person is successful, it's because that person is talented and has worked hard. And this is also important, a person who is talented and works hard also deserves the success that they achieve. So if they're successful, it's because they're talented and work hard. And if they are successful, it's also that they deserve the success that they achieve because they got it on the back of their own talent and their own merit, right? Why it's called a meritocracy. So the idea, the historical idea, that a society or an economy should be a meritocracy is a challenge to the idea that a society or an economy should be organized according to inherited privilege. So it's an idea that is connected to the Enlightenment and to a post-feudal industrial age and to the Industrial Revolution and to liberalism. So liberalism is, the Age of Enlightenment comes about in the same period. So these thoughts, these ideas, the end of feudalism, the end of the supreme power of the monarchy, the rise of individual rights, the egalitarian principles of liberalism, and the idea that the individual should rise on the basis of his own merits, rise or fall on the basis of his own merits, rather than rise and fall on the basis of inherited privilege. All of this is linked to that early period or derives from or had its genesis in that early period of the end of the feudal age and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of the Enlightenment, the beginning of liberal political ideas and liberal ways of establishing the legitimacy of power. So that's where this whole idea of meritocracy comes from. So initially, it is a profoundly egalitarian ideal. So the idea here is that we're doing away with a social order that apportions success, that determines success, wealth, prestige, and so on, according to inheritance and the status of your family as a member of the nobility, or as landowners, or as peasants, or laborers. So now the idea is that anyone can get ahead and succeed in business, or politics, or show business, regardless of where they were born, so long as they work hard and have talent and make good decisions and choices. And so the shorthand for this mind frame or this set of beliefs is the American dream. The American dream is that anyone can make it in America if they are smart and they work hard and they make good decisions. And of course, it's called the American dream, but it's not limited to the United States. Canada also sets itself up as a meritocracy, a place where immigrants can come and work hard, and hard work and talent are rewarded, and anyone can succeed. And that is the freedom and the fairness of a meritocracy, right? That's where the power of the idea of a meritocracy comes from, is that it seems free and fair, and it seems also revolutionary compared to historical ideas about, what determines your life is who your father was and who your grandfather was. And no doubt, this idea of a meritocracy is profoundly and deeply embedded in our lives and in our concepts of what matters and how to get ahead. So it's an idea that I'm sure that many of you and in particular many of your parents almost certainly take for granted. And by that, what I mean is that most people, including most people who are listening to this lecture, believe that success should depend on a person's talents and hard work, and that a person who is talented and who works hard deserves the success that they achieve. And so this is how Sandel describes it in an interview in The Guardian. He says, the solutions to problems of globalization and inequality, and we heard this on both sides of the Atlantic, he's referring to North America and Europe, was that those who work hard and play by the rules should be able to rise as far as their effort and talents will take them. And he says, this is what I call in the book the rhetoric of rising. It became an article of faith, a seemingly incontrovertible or uncontroversial trope. We will make a truly level playing field, it was said by the center left, so that everyone has an equal chance. And if we do, and insofar as we do, then those who rise by dint of effort, talent, hard work will deserve their place, will have earned it. So Sandel points out that this idea of taking responsibility for what happens in your life, and especially the idea of telling others to take responsibility, is popular across the political spectrum. So it's well known, for example, that Barack Obama, even before he became president, and then long after he was president, even still today, he often gives speeches in which he calls on people, and in particular black men, to take responsibility for their families, for their children, and for their own well-being. So this is a quote from USA Today from a long time ago, before, or as he was campaigning for, I think it was when he was campaigning for president, Barack Obama pressed his call for African Americans to take more personal responsibility. And so the critique of meritocracy from the left is basically that it is a good idea in principle, but that we have yet to achieve a universal level playing field. In other words, meritocracy is good, but it doesn't exist. Instead, it is still too often the case that the children of wealthy people go to good schools and universities, they perform well on tests, and they have access to high-paying jobs and nice homes in good neighborhoods. The children of wealthy people turn out well, and the children of poor or racialized children, the children of poor or racialized people, do not have the same advantages. And while technically there are no longer institutions or universities or neighborhoods or jobs that are closed to the children of poor people, in real life, the children of wealthy people rise not so much on their own merit, but rise on the basis of their inherited advantages. And the children of poor people remain poor, not so much on their own merit, but on their inherited disadvantages. So that, I would argue, is the left-wing critique of meritocracy. And on the conservative end of the political spectrum, the critique of meritocracy would be that it is an ideal that is failing to function properly because there's too much interference from governments and institutions that are trying to mess with meritocracy to produce, to improve the life chances of people who historically are disadvantaged, people who are poor and racialized and female, people who have been excluded from the system of meritocracy altogether. So on the right, people would tend to argue that what we need is just more meritocracy, that there should not be anything like affirmative action or gerrymandering or any other weight on the scale that is designed to give access to people who have been excluded. That instead the system should be allowed to run fairly, that a meritocracy should be allowed to just take its course, and if some people don't do well, well, that's on them. That's because they don't work hard enough, and so forth. So I would say that's one of the arguments about meritocracy that's coming from the right. Another argument, another position that I think we hear from the right is essentially that that meritocracy works, that it's alive and well, and that everyone has the same shot at success. So the argument, this position, is that not only that meritocracy is good, but also that it is functioning well. And so that position, people who take that position would point, for example, to an individual extraordinary case. And they would say, look, a black man with a single mother from a very modest upbringing became president of the United States. So that means that meritocracy is alive and well. And here we have an example of the American dream in action. And this is essentially the same story that Obama tells about himself. He says, I was raised by a single mom, my dad was absent, we had no wealth, and yet I became president of the United States. And that's because I worked hard and I had the right set of values, but it's also because the United States is a country where that can happen. So it's a story that he tells about himself, but it's also a story that he tells about the values that exist in the United States. And so, arguably, I would argue that the framework of meritocracy really relies to a large extent on the existence of these extraordinary outliers, these individuals who beat the odds and do well even though the structures of power are stacked against them. It's stories like that, like the story of Barack Obama, that make people believe that there are no structures of power that are stacked against anyone. So I invite you, for example, to look at the people of color who are running for the Republican ticket in the United States. and who have run run for office as Republicans, people like Nikki Haley and Tim Scott. And they tell the same story. They say, you know, I'm a black man, I am an Indian woman, and yet I am here at the pinnacle of political power in the United States because I worked hard and because the United States is a place where that can happen, where a person like me can live the American dream. And that is meritocracy at work. So that is the sort of the ideas within which Sandel is making his own argument. And he takes a position that is neither the position of the right nor the position of the left. He does not argue that meritocracy is good, but it doesn't exist because we still don't have a level playing field, and nor does he take the view that meritocracy is good, but that we're helping too many people succeed by intervening in the proper functioning of the market and of meritocracy. Instead, what Sandel is arguing is that even if meritocracy worked well, it undermines the social fabric of the nation. Even if meritocracy worked well, it undermines the social fabric of the nation. What he argues is that there is a dark side, a demoralizing side to meritocracy, and the reason is that the implication is that those who do not rise have no one to blame but themselves. Okay, this is the argument he's making, is that those people who do not rise have no one to blame but themselves. So in a meritocracy, he says, the poor are given an invitation. The argument is that the poor have an open invitation to better themselves, to improve their lot in life, or to bear responsibility for their own failure. Meritocracy gives them both, right? The flip side of the same coin of you rise on the basis of your own hard work and talents is if you have not risen, that's because you have not worked hard and you have no talents. And what I'm going to, so what I want you to do is listen very carefully to the podcast interview with Michael Sandel so that you understand more fully, more robustly his argument against meritocracy. And then what I'm going to do next is to make the case that the tyranny of merit, what Sandel calls the tyranny of merit, also shapes political discourse with what I'm going to call the politics of individual responsibility. So the tyranny of merit has also created a politics of individual responsibility. I believe that this idea that it's on you, this idea that we have to take individual responsibility for fixing many of the social and political problems that our societies face, I think it's linked to the politics of merit or the ideology of merit. And I also think that it's a powerful trope or framework of contemporary politics. So I'm going to give you a few concrete examples. So this framework is certainly predominant in the sphere of employment and salary, personal and family wealth, home ownership, and so forth. So how well you do, how much money you make, where you live, what kind of car you drive, all of this we understand as being a matter of how hard you work and what choices you make and how good you are at your job. And this is where Sandel's argument about meritocracy mostly takes place. It mostly happens in the sphere of wealth and economic well-being. But it also happens in the sphere of education. You know, whether or not you get into University of Toronto and how well you do at university depends entirely on how well you did in high school and how hard you worked and so on and so forth. So this idea of merit and individual responsibility extends beyond the sphere of employment and wealth and into the sphere of education. So whether or not this is true is going to be a matter of some debate. But I'm sure that you're aware that this is a dominant narrative. It's a pretty widespread way of thinking about success and failure, and it's also an idea of thinking about success and failure that ties that success to what you deserve. And that the idea of desert, of something that you deserve or you don't deserve, is important here. That if a person is wealthy, it is because they worked hard and they made good choices, and so that wealth is their just desert. It's what they deserve. And the flip side of the coin, of course, is that a person who is poor must also deserve their poverty. So some of us might disagree with this narrative, right? We might put more emphasis on the structural barriers to success. We might make the case that advantages and disadvantages have less to do with how hard a person works and more to do with whether they're racialized or whether they're poor, whether they had access to after-school tutoring, whether they were able to go to a private school for high school, and so on and so forth. So, you know, some of us argue more for structural disadvantage, and some of us argue more for individual responsibility. But nevertheless, we're very familiar with this kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, work ethic kind of language. And it's dominant in, let's say, in Canada. It's hegemonic with the Conservative Party, but it's also dominant with the Liberal Party of Canada, which is supposed to be more centrist than the Conservative Party. So even centrist political parties have this kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps framework for thinking about economic responsibility and the logic important point that I'm making here is that the story of individual responsibility is so powerful that it extends beyond the sphere of personal economic success into areas that we wouldn't naturally or automatically think of as being a matter of personal responsibility, or that we didn't think of that way until recently. And one area is that of health. So we're seeing a new public discourse about individual responsibility for our health. So let me give you an example. A few years ago, I wrote a book called Lactivism, and it was a book about the politics of breastfeeding. And in the book, one of the things that I tried to write about, to figure out, was why so many people were so invested in breastfeeding when, in fact, the benefits that breastfeeding might confer on any individual child were very modest. And the evidence for those benefits was mostly inconclusive. So the point that I make in the book, one of the points that I make, is that the science behind breast is best is pretty shaky. In all likelihood, breastfeeding probably makes very little difference. For most babies, it really doesn't matter much if mothers breastfeed or not. And yet, there's a great deal of activism and interest surrounding breastfeeding. Mothers who don't breastfeed are shamed for endangering their babies. Many hospitals don't allow mothers to feed their babies formula unless a doctor signs a prescription for it. And over the last decade or so, you've got famous people who have given birth posting selfies of themselves breastfeeding on social media. There's actually even a name for those breastfeeding selfies. They're called breastfeed. I wish I was joking, but I'm not. And not only that, not only is it, not only has it basically become a requirement, a social requirement, but most countries in the world also have public campaigns that promote breastfeeding. So governments have campaigns like the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative that encourages new mothers to breastfeed by making it harder for them to access formula. Governments offer more benefits to breastfeeding mothers who are on welfare, and so on and so forth. So one of the reasons, the specific reason that I want to talk about today for the rise of the importance of breastfeeding has to do with the link between breastfeeding and a politics of framing health and well-being as a matter of individual responsibility. Okay, there's a link between breastfeeding. I argue in this book that there's a link between breastfeeding and framing health as a matter of individual responsibility. So the story that's coming out of public health institutions, like the Public Health Agency of Canada or the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, and even out of global public health institutions like the World Health Organization, all of these public health organizations have a common narrative, which is this. They say that most of the money we spend on healthcare is spent on treating people with chronic illnesses. So they say most of the money we spend on healthcare is spent on people with chronic illnesses. And then they go on to define chronic illnesses as those that are brought about or exacerbated by individual lifestyle choices. So these are things like asthma and hypertension and diabetes, cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, obesity, and even many forms of cancer. So they argue that these are all chronic illnesses, and then they define chronic illnesses as those that are caused or exacerbated by the lifestyle choices that people make. Things like smoking and failing to exercise and eating unhealthy food. So in other words, we're in a world where public health agencies and institutions make people themselves, they speak a language, or they tell a story in which people themselves are responsible for their own bad health because they're making poor lifestyle choices. So the argument of these organizations is that poor health is an individual's own fault and responsibility. So what I have here on the screen is a specific example of such a report from Canada, which not only attributes so-called chronic illnesses to lifestyle choices, but then also quantifies how expensive those chronic illnesses are. So it's quantifying how much Canada spends on treating chronic illness that are individuals' own responsibilities. And then here, this author goes even further to specify that it is mostly poor people who get these diseases and have these bad habits and are therefore costing Canada so much money. So breastfeeding fits very neatly into this narrative because it casts infant health as a matter of individual maternal responsibility. So not only is your own health your responsibility, but the health of your baby is also your responsibility. And the health of your baby depends on whether or not you breastfeed. So let me come at this from a different angle here to try and describe what's going on here in a different way. Let's say that public health institutions decided, let's say they made a different argument. Let's say that they decided that what mattered most to infant health was keeping a mother and a baby in the hospital for 72 hours after birth. If that was what mattered most, then the government would probably be investing in more hospital beds and more nursing and medical staff. Or let's say that public health institutions decided that what mattered most was the mental health of the mother. Then they would invest more in postpartum mental health support and maybe guaranteed safe housing for mothers who fell below a certain income level, supports for maternal mental health. Or let's say what mattered most is high quality daycare. Then what a government would do would be to build or license more daycares and invest more public money in training for people who work in the field of early childhood education. So the point I'm making, obviously, is that what is our stories, the stories we tell about what is important, have an impact on where we place responsibility. And they have an impact on our public policies and on how we direct and allocate funding. And if our story is that what matters most for infant health is breastfeeding, then we're telling a story about individual responsibility. And then we, as a society and as a government, we don't need to invest in anything at all other than getting more women to breastfeed for longer periods of time. And like many other so-called lifestyle choices, breastfeeding rates differ by race and class. So breastfeeding is much more common among women who are white and middle or upper middle class and have more education. So just like smoking and physical inactivity, feeding your baby formula from a bottle is much more prevalent among women who are poor and racialized. And so if a country's public health narrative emphasizes the cost of poor lifestyle choices, including smoking and feeding babies formula, that narrative is not only blaming smokers and formula feeders for bad health, it's specifically blaming people who are poor and Black or Indigenous. So the politics of individual responsibility does not only burden individuals with responsibility for their own health, it does additional work here by burdening specific categories of individuals, specifically people who are poor and racialized. So I did a podcast interview with our friend Diva Woodley, who you're already familiar with in this class, who writes about social movements. And Woodley critiqued this perspective in that podcast by saying, actually, your ill health is not necessarily your fault, especially if you have no access to health care. You do not have access to good nutrition. You don't have access to outdoor public spaces where you can walk around. If a society is structured so that most people will be unwell, then their illness is not their individual problem, she's arguing. It's a structural and social problem, and the only way to heal that is actually through the pursuit of justice. So similarly, the zealotry around breastfeeding places the lion's share of the responsibility for a baby's health and well-being, places that responsibility on the mother. So public health officials say that breastfeeding will protect a baby from infections. Among other things, will protect a baby from infections. But actually, babies get infections when they go to daycare. And in the United States, babies often go into daycare at 6 or 8 weeks. And the reason that's the case is because mothers in the United States do not have federally mandated paid maternity leave. So mothers take on the individual responsibility of breastfeeding because they worry that their babies are going to get infections if they don't. Whereas in fact, the reason that the babies are getting infections is because of the absence of a government policy, maternity leave, that no amount of breastfeeding is ever going to change. And in Canada, instead of placing blame on a failing and underfunded healthcare system, where it's very difficult to find a pediatrician or a primary care doctor, even in a big city like Toronto, the government is blaming the healthcare crisis on people who don't get enough exercise and smoke and don't eat well and don't breastfeed, instead of taking responsibility for the scarcity of doctors and healthcare in Canada. So that's the way in which the politics of individual responsibility works in the sphere of healthcare. Climate change is another issue that is often framed as a matter of individual responsibility. So when my son was in the 2nd grade, he came home from school with instructions from his teacher to monitor how much water our family used in a week. So how many times did we do the laundry? How long did we spend washing dishes? How often I used the dishwasher? How long we spent in the shower, and so on and so forth. So he encouraged us to be brief when we brushed our teeth so that, we could get our numbers down. And then he turned this information into a graph, so they were learning about how to make graphs, and the children compared their graphs in the classroom to see where their families were failing and where each family could improve their personal habits in order to stop global warming. And I'm for sure absolutely all about saving water. I really am. But at the same time, I would like it if the Toronto District School Board would teach children in second grade that Canada has to invest in green energy and it needs to stop fracking and drilling in the oil sands, and it should diversify the economy so that Canada depends less on oil and gas revenues, instead of telling students in second grade that the solution to global warming is that their mother needs to take shorter showers. So health and climate change, right? Those are two areas in which the discourse of individual responsibility is very prevalent, and it powerfully shapes how we understand both what the problem is and what the range of solutions are. And I encourage you to think about other issues that are often framed not primarily as structural problems or as issues of public policy, but rather as issues for which we need to take individual responsibility. And so then once you've identified, what are 2 or 3 other issues that look like this, where there's a prominent discourse of individual responsibility, then I'd like you to consider independently whether individual responsibility is actually the best solution to the problem, or whether public policies and public institutions might work better. Whether this is, what's the politics of why this issue is getting framed as a matter of individual responsibility, and then what's underlying that? Who gets blamed for it? Who is winning in this discourse? Who's losing in this discourse? What public policies are we implementing as a result of this discourse? What other public policies are we not implementing as a result of this public discourse? And so on and so forth. So those are the things that I'd like you to think about. Those are the takeaways that I'd like you to consider as you think about Thank you very much. I hope you have a